first speaker today is Ken Hosack, VP of Business Development at CradlePoint. Ken has a diverse background in engineering, manufacturing, product management, and business development. Ken is considered a thought leader in mobile broadband networking, and he's regularly asked to moderate panels or speak at conferences about the challenges of networking in the distributed enterprise. Ken came to CradlePoint after serving as VP of Marketing and Business Development at a series of successful software startups. Prior to that, Ken worked in various engineering and product management roles at Hewlett-Packard. He holds a degree in electrical engineering and a master's in manufacturing engineering, both from Stanford. Also joining us today is CradlePoint's resident PCI compliance expert and Level 3 enterprise support engineer, Rudy Cedillo. Prior to CradlePoint, Rudy was a senior systems engineer at SuperValue and director of network and IT security at Winco Foods, a supermarket store with 86 locations in the western U.S. While at Winco, Rudy was primarily responsible for ensuring Winco's networks were PCI compliant. His experience also includes working as a sales engineer for Endpoint Protector, a company focused on the security of client endpoints in the retail, healthcare, and entertainment industries. With that, I'll hand it over to Ken to get us started. Ken?
Hey, thanks, David, and appreciate your time and to join us here as we talk about PCI compliance. Again, this is Ken Hosack. I feel very fortunate to have Rudy Cedillo here because he has some very good hands-on expertise and background in applying the concepts we're going to go in an actual retail environment. So what we're going to do is walk through an overview of the PCI compliance spec, or PCI DSS 2.0, and then review the individual requirements plus our recommendations. And I'll just say right from the beginning, knowing who the attendance is on this, anyone who really has spent time with PCI compliance knows that this is not something you can review in depth in 45 minutes or an hour. And so what our objective here is to give more or less a high-level overview and provide some specific CradlePoint recommendations based on our customers' experience that you might be able to use. If you do want more detailed information, I'd encourage you to basically call us up at CradlePoint. We have some fairly detailed application guides. We also have professional services and other folks here that can help go into more detail. And we are likely going to set up a more advanced webinar in the future as well. But if you want to get an overview of how CradlePoint fits in the PCI compliance space and some good recommendations for how to set up a robust implementation and manage that implementation, then this is a good webinar for you.
Yeah, Ken, that's really good. Some good points there on the overview. I'd like to just go ahead and throw out that we can help you to get a lot of the footwork done early on, so you don't have to go through so much pain, because there are a lot of merchants that do not understand PCI. So we just want to kind of do an overview of it for you.
Okay, excellent. Let's jump into it. First of all, just an overview of CradlePoint. Our focus is the distributed enterprise, and within the distributed enterprise, it's primarily retail, so retail stores, restaurants, quick service restaurants, convenience stores, but also financial branch offices who actually have a lot in similar with retail environment. In fact, real estate brokers call them quasi-retail. If you look at an H&R Block, or if you look at some of the investment brokerages that have tens of thousands of locations across the U.S., a lot of them are in retail environments and face the same issues. We also have a fairly large business in the kiosk ATM segment, and what we've found is that the PCI compliance applies to kiosks. Essentially, it's an automated retail location, and when we talk to our larger kiosk customers, many of them have told us that PCI compliance is probably the single biggest driver to keeping their business alive. If they do not are unable to maintain their PCI compliance, their whole revenue stream is at risk. In terms of solution overview, we have three types of products on the bottom. We have enterprise routers, enterprise bridges, and M2M routers. WiPipe Central is our management platform. and on-site services. The reason I'm providing this as an overview is as we go through the recommendations, we'll be giving some recommendations for things that you'll want to do up front on the installation and the initial configuration. We'll be providing some things that you'll want to do in configuring the routers or the bridges themselves. And then we'll provide recommendations for how we believe that you should use management, whether it's CradlePoint's WiPipe central management or if you have your own management framework, how to really incorporate that into your PCI compliance regime.
That's really going to be the key for you to become efficient, is to have a good network management tool for all your auditing and all your reporting. So as Ken mentioned, our WiPipe Central product does that with our routers. Extremely easy. So we encourage you to as we speak about WiPipe Central, to just keep an open mind about it.
All right, let's dig into the PCI standards themselves. The diagram I have showing here doesn't represent how thick the actual document is. I have it here on the desk, and when you print out the standard and all the other documents, it's a fairly thick binder. My binder is a 4-inch binder, and it's fairly full. But the background, the whole reason for PCI compliance is ultimately trying to protect cardholder data. It's as simple as that. It's the people that use credit cards, that have accounts. It's to protect their sensitive data. And the PCI compliance standard, or the specs, are required for any company that stores, processes, or transmits credit card info, no matter how big or how small. The standard was founded by 5 major financial brands. It shouldn't be a surprise that it's Amex, Visa, MasterCard, Discovery, and JCB. And the participants that participate in driving the standards include hundreds of industry entities.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add there is that we speak about credit card data, but it also incorporates debit card data too. So just want to make that clear.
Yeah. And for those of you that aren't necessarily in an environment where you have to comply with PCI compliance, these are just good best practices for securing your networks. For those of you that are familiar with PCI compliance, there's a lot of controversy about kind of the requirements, how it's applied. You know, some people feel that maybe it's too stringent, et cetera, but if you set apart the enforcement issues that are out there, fundamentally these are good practices regardless of what kind of business you're operating. So the reason, the fundamental business drivers are that companies that fail to comply, the way this is set up, they're subject to fines, lawsuits, or even can be banned from processing credit cards. And frankly, that could be the easy out. But if you find that you are breached and that hackers were able to access your credit card data, you're going to find yourself in the news headlines. You're going to find yourself having serious impact with your customers in terms of customer goodwill, and you're going to have to answer to your shareholders. So it's the stakes are high.
Yeah, extremely high. So although as we go through, it might seem like it's a big elephant, it has to be done.
So looking at the specs themselves, the PCI, and I have a little cheat sheet at the bottom. PCI stands for Payment Card Industry. The SSC is the Security Standards Council within the PCI group that sets the actual standards. The DSS is the flavor of the standard that we're going to talk about. There's actually 3 standards, but the DSS is the Data Security Standards. The other 2, PTS applies to the card readers, the actual, when you swipe a credit card, the actual physical hardware that you're swiping. And then the PA DSS applies to any application that is handling cardholder data. But since we're a networking equipment company, we're going to focus on the DSS, which is Data Security Standards for, you know, for the system, for the merchant qualifying their system. You'll also see in our slides reference to the CDE. It's the cardholder data environment. It's that part of your network that touches where any of the devices can touch cardholder data. So moving on, the PCI DSS, the way it's set up is that there's an initial certification process and then an ongoing monitoring process. The initial certification process, it really depends on your company size, whether you can self-certify or whether you have to have an external audit. My father, among other things, owns a small bed and breakfast in a rural town, and it was funny when he called me up and said, Ken, they took away my credit card machine. They said to get it back, I need to do something called PCI compliance, and I had to feign ignorance because I didn't want to really dig into it. But I can tell you that small business owners find this very confusing, and it's not really that different for the larger enterprises.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add there is that as you go through these steps, you'll see or you'll find that auditors are, they're not all the same. So somebody might come in and review your information and be extremely hard on you. Another one might be extremely easy on you. So that's just something that you need to know up front when you're preparing for your PCI audit.
So a couple other acronyms that you'll hear is, and I want to address these now, but the QSA is a Qualified Security Assessor. He can be your best friend or your worst enemy, depending on how prepared you are for these audits. And then an Approved Scanning Vendor, ASV. But in order to the larger enterprise, you have to basically use QSA or an ASV to demonstrate compliance. Okay, so customer pain points, and this is talking to our customers, what we found is that regardless of the size of the company, many companies do not have the in-house expertise, and it can be confusing or intimidating process at the beginning. The larger companies do have dedicated resources for this. I mean, Rudy, you can.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Most the larger houses do have, larger companies do have expertise, and as we point out here, some of the pain points, you go into expense, you might end up having to come in and swap out all your hardware because it's not network managed, which is one of the requirements on the PCI side of it. So, and then the smaller businesses don't have that expertise, and they might have to consult it out or try to minimize their pain point as far as their end devices and try to segment it, make it a little bit easier, and we'll get into that as we go in here a little bit more.
So as we talk to our customer base, and we just were fortunate enough to finish our customer advisory council last week where we had some of our larger customers come in and give us their direct feedback on this. On the expense side, there's a couple portions of that are really key in terms of the audit. One is preparing for the audit, the expense and the time and the effort to get ready for your audit, and then the second is the expense of actually conducting the audit. We talked to one of our larger QSR or quick serve restaurant customers who said that their initial audit, they were expecting to spend 60 to 80 hours just to get ready for the audit, and then the audit itself, depending on how prepared they were, could take 5 or 6 hours if you're lucky. It could be longer. Our goal at CradlePoint is to provide technology, applications, etc., to drive that down. Both the prep time as well as the actual audit time. All right, and then just a note on PCI compliance. We often get asked, is your router PCI compliant? And it's a hard one to ask because obviously you want to say yes. But the fact is there is no certification for routers. It's not there. They have certification for applications. There is certification for the PIN, the hardware that swipes the credit card, and then there's a certification for the merchant's system, which includes network devices, servers, point-of-sale devices, etc. So there is no such thing as a PCI compliant router. It just has to be certified as part of a merchant's network by a QSA or an ASV.
You'll find that the actual certification, like Ken says, are really at the endpoints. They're your clients or your servers, but everything else in between is not subject to certification. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. So having said that, we do use external penetration testing firms. So we'll take our routers and bridges and send it to these firms, give them access to it, and a lot of these they employ what they call ethical hackers, who are just security experts who really can take their best shot at it. And so CradlePoint on a regular basis does do penetration testing, all in the spirit of making sure that when you use a CradlePoint router in your PCI compliant environment, that you're going to pass your audit. And and more importantly, that you're going to be more protected for security issues. All right, let's dig into the meat of it. What we're going to do is we're going to go through the 12 PCI compliant requirements and give you our recommendations for how to successfully set up, the router, the management software to ensure that your chances of passing an audit and making sure that your security processes are in place. So first of all, I mentioned in an hour you're really not able to go into a lot of detail. I'd encourage anyone who really wants to dig into the detail. We have an application guide, which is an 80-page document we'd be happy to share with anyone who's participating in this webinar, that goes through a detailed review of each of the requirements as well as the specific CradlePoint enablers and recommendations. And I'll let David follow up afterwards on how to get access to that. The standard itself, the way that they outline the 12 requirements is they have goals and requirements. 6 goals, 12 requirements. And when you kind of read through them on the left, they're fairly straightforward. Build and maintain a secure network. Fairly simple. Protect cardholder data. If you look at the requirements, number 3 or number 4, one is for stored data and one is for transmitted data. Maintain a vulnerability management program. Make sure that you're not setting yourself up for security holes. Antivirus software, hackers love to put software on computers inside a network and use that as kind of a proxy for gaining access to information that they shouldn't. But also make sure that your systems and applications are properly designed, implemented, and secured through proper configuration. So once you've got your system set up, you want to make sure that you've implemented strong access control measures. You want to restrict access to that cardholder data specifically to people who have a need to know. But once you've determined who should have access to that data, you want to make sure that each person has a unique ID. You want to make sure that someone can't log in pretending they're someone else and try and get access to data that they shouldn't. And you also have to make sure that you're protecting physical access to cardholder data. So this could range anywhere from access to servers or routers, physical access, but also if you do any sort of offline storage, you have media, tapes, CDs, etc., DVDs, then you want to make sure that you're protecting those as well, because hackers know that you can get those in transit. And then the last two, you just need to regularly monitor and test your networks. Make sure you know who's accessing the networks. Make sure that you're testing on a regular basis your security systems, processes, etc. And really, and this is a very important thing for passing an audit, is you really need to make sure that you have a good policy, good processes documented on information security for all of your people.
Yeah, that's really good, Ken. Absolutely right there on the last one. The sooner you get the procedures in place and a policy that enforces that, then you'll find that this is an ongoing thing. You're always going to be around with it as long as you're doing credit cards. So the faster you can get that done and the more efficient, and the better you're off.
All right, let's drill down into the first requirement, install and maintain firewalls. And again, the goal is to make sure that you have a solid firewall configuration of your system. And I'm not talking about the router, I'm talking about the merchant's system. Make sure that your firewall is set up. And it's basically what you want to make sure is that when you configure your router and set up your firewall, you want to make sure that you absolutely, in fact, some customers say a deny-all approach is what you start with between any untrusted networks and any system components within your cardholder data environment. And you want to prohibit, absolutely prohibit, any direct public access between the internet and any system component within the CDE.
Yeah, and the important thing to remember too is, although you want to do a deny-all, think of it that not only are you denying inbound, but you really have to deny outbound also. And you have to think about who has access to that data. And when you approach it that way, it's easier for you to set up your firewall rules. And And in some environments, you might have 2,000 lines of firewall rules. It can get extremely complicated, and it really all depends on how many different clients you have, how many different people are accessing it and so forth, or endpoints and so forth. So those are things you want to keep in mind, so you try to minimize those firewall rules.
So our number one, or our first recommendation, and what you'll see is a picture of a CradlePoint router here, but what you want to do is segment your network into individual security zones. A lot of our customers in the distributed enterprise are small, what I call small footprint retail or small footprint branch offices, where it's a fairly small office. They don't need a huge heavy metal router to be able to handle the needs of that location, but they do have a very simple need. And in some cases these are franchise owned, so very cost sensitive environment. What you want to do is get the most bang for your buck out of your router and your network connection. One of the easiest ways to do this is to segment the network into individual security zones.
Yeah, that's great. And the way that this drawing shows it, it's really ideal for the smaller offices, because what you'll see in PCI is that any equipment that passes data is subject to the PCI requirements. In this case, this router would be, but if you segment the way we show it here, then you can actually put another switch behind the POS device and put all your devices on that, and then nobody else. You don't have to worry about all the other networks and the equipment there. So that'll kind of minimize it, make it a little bit easier to control, and much less expensive than what you might think going forward.
A lot of the network administrators call this descoping your CDE environment. Try to get as many devices off of the network that's handling your point-of-sale devices. So on the left, and you can see the bouncing ball there on the employee segment, that's where you want to put your manager's PC, or if you're a large distributed enterprise, a lot of times you have regional personnel, et cetera, that are visiting that want to be able to use their laptops either via wired connection or Wi-Fi. Put that on a separate segment and have that segment have a separate authentication scheme. You probably want to use your corporate radius server to authenticate the employees. And once you put everything on that segment, it's separate than your point of sale segment. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time in that segment making, with PCI compliance per se.
Yeah, and you touched on the Wi-Fi too. That's an area that needs to get a lot of attention. We're just going to touch on it here, but if you're doing credit card transactions over wireless, then that's a whole nother level that you really need to think about. And moving forward, we can touch on it a little bit more, but it's probably the one place that people get hacked the most. So,
one of the on the point of sale segment, from a CradlePoint's perspective, if you are using Wi-Fi there, obviously you want to use the highest level standard you can, WPA2 Enterprise. But we'd also recommend tying that into a radius server that authenticates your individual point-of-sale devices, just to make sure that anything that connects there is legit.
And hiding the SSID.
Yeah, absolutely, for the point-of-sale devices. And then, in this example, I mean, these network segments can be anything you want, but in this case, we set up one for vendors. A lot of our distributed enterprise customers have third-party companies for video surveillance, monitoring the level of the fuel tank, for example, or HVAC control, heating and air conditioning. This is the segment that, if you choose to, you can provide to your vendors and let them share your router, share your network connection, maybe even charge for it without getting in the way of your PCI compliance. And then finally, on the public segment, our routers support public hotspots, customer Wi-Fi, and I think for those of you in retail, that's a big area right now. Is how do you support customer Wi-Fi in a way that is secure, that doesn't put your PCI compliance in jeopardy, and that that somehow benefits the business, where you're getting some benefit by letting them use the customer Wi-Fi. And in this case, again, the whole theme is descoping it outside of the CDE, the customer data environment, by creating separate network segments. All right, on the second, configure the firewall. just talking about some of the things you'll want to do. Stateful packet inspection. What you're doing is you have the ability, the router has the ability to really take a deep look at packets and make sure that they're legit. If the router is getting a response from the outside world, typically it needs to match the request that came from the router to make sure that that matches. And so making sure that you have SPI, which CradlePoint routers support, making sure you have that turned on and configured properly is a very important part of making sure that your firewall is configured. The port forwarding rules, what you want to make sure is that if there is external traffic that does need to reach a computer or device inside your network, and by the way, that should be a limited number, but you are going to have situations where you need to properly set up your port forwarding rules to have a controlled method of opening the firewall to make sure that those outside requests go specifically to that network resource and application.
Yeah, and for those of you that would be doing that, or that have that requirement, and for a lot of systems, you might be better off putting in a bastion host in a DMZ and then controlling all the access from it. Because then that limits your firewall rules quite a bit, and it's a little bit more of a trusted system. And also, it's just another level of protection for you, rather than allowing somebody to get in and try to access all your ports and so forth.
So we have hackers love to spoof addresses as a way to pretend that they're a trusted resource or trusted user to access the network. And we have some anti-spoofing features that are, again, we build upon generally accepted industry principles as we implement that in the router, but that's one of the things you want to make sure is turned on the router as well. Packet normalization. Hackers love to send in misconfigured or changed or modified packets into the network as part of their hacking attempt, and packet normalization looks for these modified packets and scrubs them so that it's not going to do any damage inside your network. Static NAT ports, DMZ. I think Rudy talked about the DMZ host. If you do want to take advantage of that DMZ, just make sure that that's configured properly. And there are tools that you can use within your network to scan for ports, access to resources, and that's something, Rudy, you might want to touch on.
Well, yeah, if you're going to set up a DMZ, I'd encourage you to set it up and then do everything you can to just get past it. Use your own tools and so forth to make sure that you have everything configured how you need to, and so forth. And you can create the DMZ at different levels and try to figure out what, some of the larger scale companies will have 2 levels of DMZs, which is really, it's kind of like if you look at some firewalls, you have different levels of security and so forth. So it's consistent with that.
Another part, and again, we're still on the first requirement, and the reason I'm saying that is the rest of them are, I think most of the things that are applicable to CradlePoint routers are in, a bulk of them are in this first requirement. We'll go through the other requirements and talk about the recommendations, but we are spending a lot of time here because this is the biggest part from a CradlePoint perspective of how we help compliance. One of the recommendations, you want to lock down your router entry points. UPnP, Universal Plug and Play, is something that was developed in the consumer world to make it easy for consumers at their house to network devices without having to have some sort of specialized certification degree or document to get it. But that lets you just simply plug in a device, and it will scan not only your NATed network, but it has the ability to penetrate firewalls to make it easy to set up devices in that environment. Not so good for the distributed enterprise environment.
Yeah, it's a great point, and you definitely want to go through and lock down things on that router, for any PCI environments.
So disable WAN pings, MAC filtering. I think that's pretty straightforward. Blacklist, whitelist. One of the features that we've added to the router, but in conjunction with WiPipe Central, our management framework, is we've had some distributed enterprise say, hey, let me know anytime someone plugs a new MAC address into my router. Because if I've gone to the effort of doing the initial store configuration, setting up the point-of-sale devices, that's pretty locked down. If someone plugs something into an Ethernet port, like a credit card skimming device, you want to know about it. And so we use that MAC notification, new MAC notification, send an alert so you can make a call to your store manager or send someone out if it's close by. IP filtering rules, again, these are, you can filter by MACs, you can filter by IP addresses. The bottom line is you really need to draw out your network topology and draw out a picture of all the systems in there and make sure that the only systems that can talk to each other are ones that you want to. And there's a whole host of tools that we provide to do that: IP filtering, MAC filtering, etc., the firewall port forwarding rules, etc. But it really starts with that documented topology of your network, and it really takes some design up front to make sure that you've done it right. Disabling remote admin. Obviously, hackers know how to scan from the outside, look for open ports, open holes, etc. And one of the things that we recommend is, at least from the CradlePoint router perspective, turn off the remote administration and use WiPipe Central. Not trying to make this a sales pitch for WiPipe Central, but the advantages you get from that type of architecture is the protocol is secure, and it's a device-initiated protocol. So it's not something that is outside the network trying to get in. It's device-initiated. And it gives you a little bit better control of configuration. You make all your changes centrally. You have the ability to control who has access to that central resource. It's a lot easier to, through system logs and configuration changes, track who is making what change on a regular basis.
That's an excellent point. I want to just touch on something there. Most of the hackers are going to be out there scanning your systems for an entry point. If you've got 50 systems, if you've got 5 systems, and you're managing those locally, that's going to be a nightmare, and it's going to be harder to verify that you've got it locked down. But if you use a network tool, whatever it is you're using, whether it's SolarWinds or WiPipe, that's where you're better off, because that's where you store all your configuration, and that's what where you want to get to for PCI.
All right, that's it for the first requirement. On the second requirement, and again, this one's a fairly straightforward one, don't use vendor-supplied defaults. And when I say defaults, this could be anything from default passwords, default IP addresses, etc. Hackers maintain lists of vendor-supplied defaults, whether it's default passwords, and they can use this in an attempt to hack in. You want to make sure you change everything that is vendor default. Passwords, if you're using SNMP, like a network management system, changing your strings there. Get rid of any accounts, whether it's on your router or your server, that you don't need. People know how to look for these, and that's one of the first things they try, frankly.
Admin.
Yeah, exactly. Anything that has admin is probably not a good idea. One of the things, jumping into the recommendations, CradlePoint, from the very beginning, we were trying to develop a fix for the common consumer router problem where people ship, and I won't use any company's names, but Linksys or D-Link. The standard router that gets shipped has a default SSID, and most people just stick it in their house, and a lot of people don't know that they need to encrypt the SSID, and so they're leaving their entire network open. CradlePoint, from the beginning, we made sure that every router we shipped had a unique SSID. We use a combination of the product name and the MAC address, which is unique to every device. And so each router has its own, essentially, password that's used for SSIDs as well as the admin login. However, it's still a vendor default password, even though it's unique to each device. A hacker can look at the CradlePoint ID, the MAC address, and look at the range, and it'd be fairly simple for them to cycle through the range of MAC addresses that CradlePoint has. So even though each router has a secure address, you want to change the password. And you want to change it not just at the very beginning when you're first setting it up, but you need a process where you're changing it on a regular basis.
Excellent point. Yeah, you want to make sure that they're not stale passwords. You've got it sitting out there for 6 months or whatever, especially more especially, I should say, in a wireless environment. So you need to set up a policy where you're going to go out and change those every 30 days, 90 days, whatever, depending on how you're set up with your network management.
If you're a local coffee shop and you have 15 locations, that might be manageable, just going to each location and changing it. But we have customers that have just almost 20,000 locations. And if you're trying to change passwords of 20,000 locations every 90 days, you have to have a way to do that in an automated fashion, and something that's secure, because you want to make sure that a hacker isn't going to jump on your method of changing passwords to change it to the password that they want. Most of our customers, we recommend using WiPipe Central, or again, there are other management tools that you can use, but the point is it needs to be automated, and it needs to be secure, and it needs to be reliable. Okay, requirement number 3 of the PCI DSS spec is to protect cardholder data. And this requirement 3 is specifically designed to protect stored cardholder data as opposed to transmitted. As such, the one recommendation we'd give from a CradlePoint perspective is if you have devices or servers that are storing credit card data, make sure that those are within your cardholder data environment, and you minimize the number of resources that are actually in that environment. So take advantage of the network segmentation to limit the number of devices that are inside that CDE, and that's a very good way of protecting the stored data. The 4th requirement is also the theme of the goal of protecting cardholder data, but this is specifically applies to data that is being transmitted. And what basically it's all about encryption. It's making sure that you have secure endpoints, you have trusted endpoints, and a way of authenticating the endpoints, and a way of securing or encrypting the data that's going over that. If you are using point-of-sale devices that use Wi-Fi, by the way, I think everyone should know this, but you got to make sure you're using the latest and greatest Wi-Fi security. And WEP is actually prohibited by the PCI compliant spec because it's so easy to hack. You really want to use WPA2 Enterprise with a Radius server. So the recommendation there is for transmitting secure data is use VPN tunnels. I know this is obvious to those of you in the distributed enterprise world that are implementing this, but you really want to make sure that that you've set up tunnels either from using the CradlePoint device as an endpoint to a VPN concentrator, or some of our customers will put a separate Linux box or PC inside the LAN of our router and do the encryption there. There's different philosophies, different ways that you can implement this, but the bottom line is make sure that you have secure endpoints and that you're encrypting the data across.
The only exception I can think of is where you've got your private lines and you're terminating into the CradlePoint there, whether you got a point-to-point or MPLS network, because the MPLS inherently is a encrypted tunnel anyway. So, but in these cases, yeah, you're going to want to make sure that you're encrypting all that data, whether it's at the network level or at the client level.
And one thing I'd like to emphasize is from a CradlePoint perspective, our routers communicate via wired and wireless service providers in combination. We have some customers that are using exclusively wireless, so they're using 3G or 4G mobile broadband as a primary connect. But a lot of our customers are using hybrid. If you are interested more in the private networking, talk to your carrier, your service provider, because a lot of them have invested heavily in setting up secure private networks on the mobile broadband network that you can tie into your corporate network in a secure way. So that's one thing to bring up with your carrier reps.
And if you do decide to go that route and you decide that you need to manage them with WiPipe, that's another area we'd have to cover, because there's just a few firewall rules you'll want to do at your corporate firewall to make sure that that router can talk back to the WiPipe cloud.
GRE is not heavily used. It's easier to set up. I think the one primary use you might see is if you're setting up customer Wi-Fi. This GRE is often a requirement from local law enforcement and you know, for the ability to just make sure that people can't come into your environment and use your network to do things that they shouldn't be doing, simply as that. So some customers will purposely use GRE for the public network, the customer Wi-Fi, specifically so that to support law enforcement with that have a need to be able to look in at that data. All right, just a couple other features. IPsec, you know, again, for those of you that implement these, this is just all part of setting up your VPN, making sure that it's encrypted and secure. Requirement 5, use antivirus software. From a CradlePoint perspective, it's this is not as big of it's not something that we can necessarily impact from the router perspective, but I just want to touch on the reason for that. One of the easiest ways a hacker can hack a network is put a little Trojan or some sort of agent on a server or a PC, an employee PC within the trusted environment, and use that to collect data and transmit it out. The two things you want to do, obviously, descope your CDE, make sure that your employees' laptops, employee PCs are in a different network segment, because if they do somehow bring in a virus or they're targeted that, you want it on a different network segment. So configure your CradlePoint router to set up those segments. But the other thing is, for the systems that are in your CDE, this is where having good firewall rules, locking down the IP addresses, can really restrict access in and out of your cardholder data environment.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add there, Ken, is to make sure that in your environment that you're not passing around a lot of USBs from system to system, especially those that are all the POS systems and so forth. So that's just another endpoint that can be hacked. So for depending, there's different programs out there that you can load up on a USB to go and download anything on your hard drive and so forth, depending on the size of it. But yeah.
Okay. Requirement 6. This is definitely an area where CradlePoint can help. It's develop and maintain secure systems and applications. And again, we essentially represent components within that system. You want to make sure that you have a vulnerability management program that ensures that your system components are protected from known issues. And one of the best things I can tell you from being within CradlePoint, we are constantly, you know, as we do our penetration testing, as we talk to customers, we're constantly looking at vulnerabilities and addressing them on a regular basis. And I think the whole spirit of the PCI DSS spec is to recognize that this is not a one-and-done process. It's a process of ongoing continuous improvement. And within CradlePoint, every firmware revision that we do, you know, it doesn't just include new functionality, but we're looking and responding to issues that our customers are telling us about. And so part of a process for maintaining, making sure that you're managing your vulnerabilities is make sure that your devices are up to date with the latest and greatest firmware. And that's why PCI requires this. So in terms of recommendations, basically twofold. One is PCI requires that if there is a critical software patch, that it be applied within 1 month of release. If you have 20,000 routers, that can be a fairly difficult process without some sort of automated tool. This is why many of our customers use WiPipe Central to manage those firmware upgrades. It lets you, but from a PCI compliance standpoint, that's why, you know, the hundreds of retailers and credit card companies that participated in developing these standards, I mean, they look at how are people hacking into systems. And one of the easiest ways to hack into systems is to find a known vulnerability and use it. And if there's a firmware update that you didn't apply that you should have, and that's how your credit card data got breached, you're going to have to answer some tough questions internally to your customers, to your shareholders, of why you weren't keeping up with the firmware. So our goal here is to just make it as easy as possible to manage that process. The second thing, it's not just the firmware, but the configuration. You want to, the people I've talked to that have had the easiest audits are the people that develop very good configuration specifications and develop a good process for enforcing that. But once you've developed your ideal configuration for your individual routers, you want to be able to lock it down. You want to prevent unauthorized changes. You want to be able to get an alert whenever someone has modified the configuration, because any configuration change that has been made that you didn't authorize, you need to look into. And one of the things you can use with WiPipe Central is the ability to centrally manage your configuration and the ability to lock it down. So if someone does, for example, in a CradlePoint router, if you change the firmware to an older version, WiPipe Central flips it right back. And we're implementing that functionality with all of the configuration changes so that you'll be able to lock it down.
The other thing too, Ken, is that what WiPipe Central will do for you is when that audit date comes up, you're able to run reports on every one of your routers, and they're all up to date, and they'll be able to. It's extremely easy to do that. So it's not like you have to maintain another server with all those reports.
Yeah. All right. So the next three requirements are really up to the merchant to develop good processes and procedures for how to restrict access to the cardholder data, make sure that each of the users have individual IDs, restrict physical access. So I'll just kind of touch on these. Requirement 7, restrict access to cardholder data. You got to identify the specific people in your organization that need to know and limit access to just those people. Requirement 8, once you've identified those people, you need to make sure that they have unique IDs, and that there is traceability, accountability, and logging so that you know everyone who's accessed your network and what changes have been made, what time they made the changes, etc. We'll talk a little bit more about the system logging in a second. And then requirement 9 is the physical access. It's hackers, a lot of times they'll use a combination of network attacks or physical attacks. If you can sneak or bribe an employee to stick a credit card skimmer in there, or bribe an employee to log into a router and you know, maybe set up a Wi-Fi, unauthorized Wi-Fi with a hidden SSID so you can break in. That's how people hack. And so that's why you want to use centralized management of passwords, centralized management of the configuration, and you want to be able, like I said, when you physically plug something into a device, you want to get an alert so you can take immediate action.
You want to make sure too, you know, you have all your stuff locked up. If it's out in the open where you have to have it, just, you know, possibly put it into some kind of NEBA cabinet that's lockable, and all your comm rooms be locked. And then so the larger companies are forced to keep a 100% record on everybody that has a key into a room and why it was issued to them and so forth. So it can get quite specific on who gets what.
Requirement 10 is regularly monitor and test your networks. Really, there's two things I'll say on this. One is it's when we get into the recommendations, syslogs, making sure that you have time sync. There's a lot of techniques that hackers use to disguise the fact that they broke into a system that you can catch through this regular process. This is going forward. In addition to the functionality that we already have within WiPipe Central and within the routers, this is an area where you'll expect to see CradlePoint come up with some very good solutions by either the end of the year or beginning of next year with regards to specific applications that centrally manage and monitor your networks for PCI compliance. There's a lot of things. We believe, I think the PCI compliance spec has an annual audit we believe that if you really want to make sure that you're not vulnerable and that you don't have security issues, that it's not an annual exercise to get ready for your audit, but you really want to be monitoring your network in real time, being able to use our routers to actively probe to see what system resources or ports you can access, make sure that you're accessing the ones that you should and only those, make sure that you can access resources that you shouldn't. And we're in a great position having all the routers out there as well as centralized management to really help facilitate this requirement 10, regularly monitor and test networks. So specifically though, on the external syslog servers, system logs are used as an audit trail, and you want to make sure that if someone is changing the configuration or logging into a system, etc., that you're tracking it, but you're also tracking unauthorized login attempts or failed login attempts, etc. And you need to persist the system logs to preserve the audit trail. Rudy, you might talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, what you're going to find is, as you get going down this track, syslog servers are extremely important, and the way to really set these up correctly is to set up 2 of them. What you'll want is one that's actually going to be your forensics box, and the other one is going to be syslog server that never gets touched. That's the one you'll hand over to the authorities, the hard drive, in case something does happen. And if they know that syslog server has been investigated or touched at any point, then it's not going to hold up in court. So you want to have 2 syslog servers, like I said, one for forensics and one that's basically just never touched. So
the other way that people falsify access is they'll change the timestamp or change the time of their routers, do some sort of action, then change it back to try and hide it. And so we recommend that you use external time servers, time synchronization, so that when you are recording those syslog events, you're generating that they're accurate and that they're essentially, you want to make sure they have the proper time. On the requirement 11 is having a process for regularly testing your security system. So if you do have Wi-Fi in your environment, you want to be able to test for the presence of Wi-Fi access points and look for unauthorized access points. One benefit of the CradlePoint routers, if you have a Wi-Fi enabled CradlePoint router, is you can take advantage of the Wi-Fi as WAN functionality, which essentially where the router acts as a client and can access the WAN over Wi-Fi. But you can use that functionality to essentially scan your Wi-Fi environment for access points and record them on a daily basis or a regular basis. And that way you have a list, and it's something you have to show to an auditor that you have a list of all the access points in your environment. This provides a way that you can automate that scanning, keep a list of it, and add that to your punch list. If you have, as you check off each authorized access point, if you have one that's on there that's been on there for more than a day or two that you don't recognize, probably something to look at. And then finally, make sure you have a good security policy. I think from a CradlePoint perspective, we have functionality features within our router and management software that you can use, but it really isn't going to matter if you don't have a good process in place and good policies in place for enforcing configuration rules, enforcing your access to your stored cardholder data, all of that. So from requirement 12 standpoint, this is where the merchant has to do some of the heavy lifting. So I have a summary of the recommendations. I think we just went through these 11 steps. You'll obviously have this presentation. You want to segment the router, configure the firewall, lock down the entry points, make sure you change the default passwords, descope your CDE, use VPN, GRE to create secure WAN connectivity, keep your devices updated with the latest and greatest firmware to minimize vulnerabilities, lock down the configuration, configure the communication with the external syslog server and time server that we just talked about, and then use WiPipe Central to just monitor PCI compliance. And I guess 2 other points on this. I think we've throughout this presentation talked about the different CradlePoint enablers, both within the router and WiPipe Central. But use us as a resource. We have very good customer experience with using CradlePoint routers in PCI compliance environments, and well over, we're talking hundreds of retail customers that have successfully passed audits, and we've learned a lot along the way. So use us as a resource. And with that, I know we ran a little bit over, but if there are any quick questions, we'd be happy to address those.